So I'm gonna go over how to restore these things and how to clean them. And I'll first start off with a request to how I guess how to remove the baffle safely, and which is actually very important because everything basically on this thing works in unison, pretty much the same way like the minute hand moves the second hand moves our hand on a clock based off the pendulum. So if the pendulum, if something happens to the pendulum, it's going to affect everything else. If something happens to the middle hand, it's going to affect everything else and onward. Because not only is this thing geared so that acoustically sound generated from the tweeter and the tangerine waveguide are meant to actually reflect off of the woofer as if the woofer were a waveguide. And you're actually supposed to listen to these things off axis. And that's why I kept typically tell them straight, unless they're like, unless they're against a wall or something, then you could just tell them inward a little bit to clear the wall. But you could try it yourself. It's not as much of a big deal now that they have really mastered the tweeter and the tangerine waveguide and the horn and everything, where you can even hear tweeter sounds coming from the outside essentially. But the sound from these things actually sound the best from about here and anywhere but here. You'll notice it, especially if you get close by, and you'll actually get close enough where you actually could make out the difference between sound coming from the tweeter and sound coming from the woofer. From there, just tilt your head a little bit over this way. You'll notice that the sound of the tweeter will actually move to here and then merge with the woofer. So it sounds like everything's actually coming from here. And then as you back off, you'll notice the sound actually seems like it comes from just the whole entire front of the speaker. And that's the whole entire point of this style of speaker, is to basically make it see, that's it's called single point, right? Is to have it so that it performs as if it's one single point of sound. The same way that, if you drop a pebble and a rock in the same place in the ocean or a swimming pool, no matter where you are, the ripples from the pebble and the rock will hit you at the same time. Whereas you drop a pebble, an inch next to the rock at the same time, no matter where you are, the pebble ripples and the rock ripples will actually hit you very, very much differently. And it'll cause all sorts of timing and coherence issues. So the reason why this actually looks like rippling of water is essentially because it is. But the outside, in order to increase volume and to make it so that the back action of the driver would perform pretty much like a LS35A, in the sense where the LS35As actually sound bigger than they really are, and they're more bassiest than they really are. These are capable of playing bass down to levels that don't make any sense for a satellite. And that's pretty obvious if you look at the specs or the measurements or anything, because the tweeter and the woofer cross over at 2.2, and the port crosses over at 54 hertz, which is a really weird place for you to put these transition points for a satellite. Usually satellites have something along the lines of a 2.7 crossover, and the port would be something like 74, which is what the eggs, these guys, have, because they're actually meant to be played as satellites, and they're meant to be played along with a woofer that is ideally placed along the same wall, which would make up for the fact that they can't play anything lower than 74 with any real gusto or moxie. Whereas these guys are actually cable playing some pretty like solid lows to the point where it's pretty much equivalent to those 50s. The difference is actually like surprisingly small. Um, and for what they are, they actually sound bigger than those 50s, even though they're like 1/3 the size. So let's go on to how. So this is my space gray set, and it's pretty much like the only reason I have them is because I use them as a point of comparison, and they were the earlier ones that came out, and whereas my favorite set are these ones. Yeah, so should probably clean this up. Whatever. Um, yeah. So you notice when they made these, they actually made it so like the front is actually a crescent shape. They didn't even make it rounded. They actually made it crescent shaped, so that way that the sound wouldn't just be like softened by the baffle. It'd be guided by the baffle to make sure that the sound is casted or dispersed more evenly laterally, but with more of a drop off vertically. So that way it would actually reduce the amount of ceiling and floor reflections. And especially with the stands, it's excellently designed. These, on the other hand, actually use the surround as a waveguide, and they perform the same function as the flattened rim that used to exist around the outside of the Unico driver. And the flattened rim on these, instead of having it so that it's just out of the way, it works as a continuity of the driver, allowing for the tweeter to combine with the woofer, and then whatever does happen to be on phase actually does get casted out, almost like there's a ring tweeter on the outside. So you hear this tweeter from the center and from the outside at the same time, and it sounds soft enough that it doesn't sound harsh, and that's what makes them sound smooth. And that's the same thing that they did here, and why they use the rubber baffle, the rubber silicone baffle in the front, rather than just making it just solid metal in front, or just doing something like this where it's just like convexed. And I mean, if they really wanted to, they could have just simulated this entire look and just made this painted black, right? It would have been the same thing. But it was actually necessary to prototype it to make it work, and to make it work in a way that would actually be possible to iterate on. So the baffle is something that is possible to remove. So this is actually how you remove the baffle, and I'm not going to do it to these ones because I have these ones placed in like how I like them. So I'm going to get back with the ones that I don't really care as much about. So basically, a birthday card, anything like that would work. Even a business card would work. Anything that would be gentle enough, but also still sharp enough that you can actually wedge it between, right about there. Because where this thing is actually being held on is fastened here, 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 and here. But it's not fastened by here or here. So if you were to grab it, get anything that's soft enough, just wedge it in right about here without scratching it. I get my fingers closer. I have easier time. Yeah, see how it's stuck in? From there, you just push. And usually, since I've already taken this off and cleaned it before, it does have an adhesive, but the adhesive is really only as strong as like Scotch tape, really. So if you wanted to, you could use like a blow dryer on low heat, and that would be enough to take care of the adhesive and make it no longer bond anymore. So yeah, you just kind of rub it up and down like that. Make sure nothing scratches. And since this is such like a soft paper, it's not really doing anything to the butyl rubber. So the goal is to not scratch this. And this is actually like the mask. The mask is actually a butyl rubber, so it's actually much stronger than the mask. Sorry, it's a silicone rubber composite. So it's actually stronger, much stronger than just the butyl rubber of the surround. So you don't want to scratch this around either. So just get enough to be able to slowly remove these. And they'll get untabbed like that. So that's the glue they use. It's more like a black tar than anything, because it's actually not really a glue. It's the same type of black tar you typically find like in a lot of circuitry. And it's just like meant to, it's kind of almost like glue tack in a way, where it never really settles, but it just kind of like stays sticky. And it doesn't really matter if you just clean it off and remove it. That's what I do, because I end up just, I don't really care about them. So these right here have a screw here and a screw here, and they're actually suspended by gaskets between, so that when these things do actually blast extremely loud, and they're actually capable of playing bass like as low as like the port itself is tuned down to 54 hertz. And that's what gave it the impression before they added the tangerine waveguide, which increased the efficiency of the tweeter to the point where it basically just like filled the entire gap all the way from 2.2 up. But when they were first marketed and they released as a home theater system, they were measured as the 3005s, and they're measured without the tangerine waveguide, and they're measured as satellites, as a home theater system. And so because of that, everyone just kind of presumed they were satellites and presumed that they added an artificial bump. So the mid bass bump at around 54 is actually not really an artificial bump. That is actually truly the port itself. So once they added the tangerine waveguide, it increased the efficiency of the tweeter enough that from the crossover point on up, it actually flattened. So that way the mid bass bump that they thought was artificially just added in just for thrills was actually not really a bump at all. It was actually a sag in the tweeter, awaiting for the heightened compression from the metal what's it called, tangerine waveguide, which is actually a type of compression horn. So the compression horn made the tweeter more efficient from the crossover on up, and so that ended up making it so that everything from 2002 on up would then be more efficient, and everything from 2002 on down would actually level off with the rest of the speaker, and it ends up playing with a sound signature that is very similar, that is pretty much identical to the LS50s, in the sense where they are very smooth, and with the advantage of having the 3D holography or ambient landscape. And this is what something like that most people are mostly stunned about, is just pretty much how they are just capable of not only sounding so big and bassy while being like a third the size of the LS50s, but how much more 3D, and how like the just like the air just sounds much more clear. And the reason why is because the internals of this thing were actually meant to simulate the LS35As, which were made out of solid birch. And the solid birch gave the ability for, rather than MDF, the box was able to resonate. And having the ability to resonate meant that it would actually reduce any sort of standing waves that would occur on the inside, while at the same time working almost like the whole entire speaker was an AVR. So the speaker, especially when like, press it up against the back wall or something like that, would actually be able to sound like it's bigger than it really is. And they try to do the same thing with these guys, where the internal parts plus the rounded shape plus the geometry of this thing plus the fact that the entire front is a waveguide would actually make it sound much larger than the speaker should sound, but also play much lower than the speaker should sound. But the lowness that the speaker is able to play wouldn't just be basic port boost. It would actually be based off of something like a lot more sophisticated than just like, adding a port, just have a boost at the Helmholtz frequency. Instead, they actually added striations here and only allowed for the bass to escape from one position, which is actually from the tip top right here. And that means that the way they added these striations, it's actually a whole bunch of blades that work almost like individual ports, pretty much like the beta to the metas, I guess. So these ports fan out and amplify the sound, and there's so many of them that it allows for the whole entire like back wave of the speaker to just continuously amplify and exit only once it's coherent enough to exit out the top and fire through the port down to the diametric opposite side of the entire capsule, out of the tilted back port right there. And that's what gives it this really, really like distinctive open baffle sound. And that's what they tried doing with the LS50s as well, by making it so that the what's it called? The port would be soft and elliptical, the same shape of these guys, but also have the mechanics of being able to move on the inside, the same way these guys do. So instead of having it so that the front and half back of these are able to move, the LS50s are also able to move with the constraint motor dampening. Instead of having it so that the back fins of the woofers are able to channel air and create its own like air bridge essentially, but still scale the sound up and amplify the sound, so that rather than just having a bass boost, you actually have an amplified melodic bass boost. That was attempted with the similar shaped elliptical feed dimensioned back port of the LS50, which is actually like gigantic. But inside of the port is actually a soft section that's supposed to work and supposed to flex and supposed to make the port more musical, which would then allow the port to not just be a bass boost, but allow for the warmth of the port to sound more melodious, the same way that these guys do, giving it more of a sense of sound and space and dimension, and making it just trying to capture the air, I guess, of the original LS35As. And it didn't actually work as well, so that's why they came out with the metas and finally sealed the gap between this and this. Whereas the LS50s actually have a sweet spot where if you play them anywhere like above like 80%, they'll start sounding shouty because air actually starts leaking from here. And when air starts leaking from here, it's kind of almost like if, every so often, like, it's almost like the second hand or the minute hand just slips every so often. So the whole entire clock just slips every so often. And it can slip forward or it can slip backward, which is what causes either congestion or shoutiness. Because if this is unable to use this as its waveguide, then it's going to coagulate the sound. Or it's going to end up over like amplifying the sound. Like, basically sounding shouty and not sounding like it's supposed to, basically. Not working as a waveguide, but basically like a weird boost of the tweeter. And you don't want to hear the tweeter and the woofer actually fight. You want to hear the tweeter and the woofer play as if they're a single sound. So these guys, what do you do about cleaning them is, I'll make a link from here. It's 21 minutes. So you basically just take them and you put it under hot water. There, you could boil these things actually, but they don't have to be that hot. And you just like leave them there for a while, right? So that these things actually expand, since they're actually rubber and synthetic. What's it called? Silicone. They're porous. So when you actually leave them in hot water, they soften. Then from there, all you have to do is add any sort of like a oil that would be something that would be semi-liquid in room temperature, kind of like coconut oil is what I usually pick. But something like even mineral oil would work. A lot of people use mink oil. I don't know why they do that, but I don't know where you can get mink oil. I don't know. It's kind of weird. But yeah, I just use coconut oil. So then basically you just, right after you take them out of the hot water, as hot as your hands could pretty much take it, you just rinse. You just pretty much like get some. You just rub them over with a bunch of. I use coconut oil. You can use mineral oil, whatever you want, and just clean them. The mineral oil then, just like the way that you um keep your car tires from cracking, ends up filling in all the gaps in there, like you're seasoning a pan or something, and it ends up cleaning out all the debris as well and moisturizing it. So it does all three. So it cleans up all the crap that's in there, it moisturizes it, and it actually restores like the fresh black look. You see a lot of people actually try to sand these things down, which is a shame. It's kind of stupid because it actually affects the sound a lot. And it's a one-way thing. Where if you sand them down, then they're gonna always be like, it's like you might as well sand down your woofer while you're at it. But that's that. Yeah, that's all you need to do. And then to reapply it, you just do that, and you just kind of put your finger around it, and it sticks. So yeah, so after you take them out of the water, just coat them with anything like just a tiny dab of coconut oil, and just rub it around. You can even add the coconut oil to like to the water, and to like for instance, you have like a casserole dish, a small one. You can add some coconut oil to the bottom and add some warm water and just kind of just drop them in there and just flop them around a little bit like it's a burger and then wipe them off. And the oil will actually clean everything out and even out everything, and it'll end up being a consistent black again. It'll look refreshed and it'll be soft again, and it will be fine. And that's actually also how I treat my rubber surrounds. Every so often, if they start looking like they're starting to look aged in any way, I actually slightly warm them up, just like with literally like I turn my hair dryer on like high, but then I put my like a towel in front of the drivers, and I just do a few zigzags until I feel like the rubber is just warmer than the air. Not hot, just kind of warmer. And then I take a tiny bit of mineral oil or coconut oil, just basically, just literally, just like a dab the size of if you were to the take like a Q-tip and just like tip the top of the oil or the top of like a coconut oil container. Just only takes that much. And then you smear a line around the entire thing. And then from there, when it's still hot, you take water and then use something like, I actually use this what's it called? Felt. It's almost like fleece. And you just pretty much rub the oil around it so it's even. And the oil ends up permeating the rubber. You don't want to do this too much, maybe once a year, only when it's needed, because the more you do it, the more you can actually extract the natural oils from the rubber. But if it's needed, then it's needed, you know. So, and a plant-based oil, I think, makes the most sense. Mineral oil, I guess, makes the second most sense because this stuff is petroleum derivative, so it lasts forever. Um, so yeah, so just basically, while it's still kind of warm, you just rub it in there and clean it up all the dust and make sure that, you know, because dust sometimes actually is very sharp and can actually cause scratches. So make sure you kind of just like brush it so that you're flicking the dust off as much as you're actually cleaning it off, like you're sweeping. And all the while you're kind of just almost like lubricating the butyl rubber. And then from there, I just do another few passes of the the hot air dryer thing that women use. The the what's it called again? Blow dryer, yeah, on like a medium heat, just to kind of, you know, let it get back to kind of a temperature again where it would actually allow for the rubber to expand just a tiny bit to absorb the remaining moisture, and then I just leave it alone, and it dries out, and it ends up looking perfect. Because what happens is that, you know, if you allow it to expand and then you just coat it evenly, you clean out whatever like dust and grease or whatever from just the ambience of the room, you know, from like the humidity and everything. The oil will end up, first of all, cleaning off anything from the pores that are now open from being heated up. But then the second time through, when you coat the thing, you're also cleaning off all the dust. And then when you heat them back up again, they end up absorbing the oil. So, and the water, you know, the water basically just ends up evaporating, but it leaves, but the water serves this function of actually leaving an even coat of oil around the entire butyl rubber. And then the butyl rubber kind of just drinks it up. And if it doesn't dry up all the way, then you know you use too much oil. And in that case, just wipe it off with a tiny bit of a wet rag until it looks dry, but at the same time supple. And that's the same thing you do with the butyl rubber, but it's easier to do with the butyl rubber masks because you can take them off. You're just basically trying to heat it up so that it would actually have the ability to expand so that you could clean it and then rehydrate it with what would, you know, naturally bond and keep the material supple and protected. And then a second pass with the heat allows it to actually absorb, and that keeps the air out. It keeps it wet. It keeps the, like, it's seasoning it essentially. So it keeps it so that the lipids just kind of fill in all the pores and keeps anything that would otherwise, like smoke in the room or something. I don't smoke in here, but anything like that from getting into the, deeply past the surface of the baffle, and it stays clean. And if it, even if, like, if something happens, it's actually pretty easy at that point to just wipe it off with just some water, because there's so much, because it's so supple from having been remoisturized essentially, then it's just very easy to clean from that point on, because it's already naturally rejecting anything that would naturally permeate it. It's almost like having an oleophobic coating by having, like by using like mutual exclusion, right? It's like if the oil you're using is actually like lighter. Sorry, if the oil you're using is actually like, yeah, whatever liquid you're using, right? If it's heavier, then it's actually gonna repel anything that's lighter. So oil is gonna repel anything that's lighter. So if you use coconut oil, that's why I think I like coconut oil the most. It actually typically becomes hard or a liquid pretty much like right around room temperature, which means that it's constantly pretty much like supple. It's constantly active and doing its job of repelling anything that would potentially be heavier than the coconut oil. And it even repels the water, and it repels anything else. But if you use a heavier oil, like a grease, then you could actually end up doing the opposite, where it actually ends up displacing the coconut oil. In that case, you're screwed, I guess. You would have to find some kind of like, you basically have to degrease it or something, or find another oil that is heavier that would then end up displacing that oil, which is not what you'd want to do. But yeah, don't use any degreasers. I wouldn't suggest that. And you have to, I would use a very light amount, super light amount, and then right away use the coconut oil method or the mineral oil method, and just coat it up right away, and then heat it up, so that way it just pretty much drinks it all up into its pores, and then you'll recognize it, that it looks fresh again, it looks black again, it looks like it's new again, and it feels even again. It feels almost like it's a little bit wet, and that's how you know that you did a good job. And that also applies for the butyl rubber surrounds. As far as for the drivers, it all really depends. Like paper drivers are the hardest to take care of. Metal drivers are among the most easy. Plastic drivers are among the most easy. You just don't want to scratch them essentially. But yeah, the rubber parts are like the ones that are the most difficult. But luckily, this isn't just butyl rubber. This is actually a much more rugged rubber. It's like a doped rubber, essentially. It's like a synthetic rubber mixed with rubber. So it's actually a lot more durable than the butyl rubber could be. So you don't really have to be that careful with it. Just don't like deliberately scratch it. Don't use any sandpapers, and don't use any harsh chemicals. Just pretty much just clean it with oil essentially. Kind of reminds me of like the way you clean a bike chain, right? It's like you clean a bike chain using like a light oil, because it's like a lot of people use WD-40, and the reason why WD-40 works very, very well to clean things is actually because it's actually a natural oil that's made out of fish that's so light that's actually able to work as a cleaning agent and a lubricant at the same time. But due to it being so light, it's actually not a very good lubricant because it actually ends up being displaced right away. So while it works very well at displacing anything, just by being such a light oil, if you were to add anything else to it, then it just ends up becoming this sticky, grimy mess. Same thing applies here. Like I wouldn't use WD-40. I would use something that would actually be like something that seems to fit with the atmosphere of the room. So if mineral oil seems like it fits with the atmosphere of the room, or coconut oil seems to fit with the atmosphere of the room. If it's really, really cold all the time, then I would probably use mineral oil. Or if it's really, really hot, I'd probably use mineral oil. But if it's like, temperate, I'd use coconut oil or some kind of like vegetable oil. And that's as far as I've seen works with like butyl rubber. Because what's weird about butyl rubber is that when you use oil to clean it, you're actually removing the natural oil that is already found in the butyl rubber, and you have to replace it with something. Because if you don't replace it with something, it's gonna just end up drying out, and it might as well be foam at that point. And once it starts drying out, it'll start crumbling. You'll get holes in it, and you're gonna have to replace it. But if you do actually clean it and keep it supple, then it'll actually last like a lifetime. It's actually crazy. But yeah, so that's how you clean them. I don't think I need to demonstrate literally actually cleaning them. I just wanted to make a video because I didn't want to mislead you and have you accidentally tear them or something and screw the front covers, because like it's not like the front covers are easy to find. The baffle mask, I mean. um but yeah, you saw me remove them. Once you remove them once, they're actually much easier to remove the second time through. Yeah, you just use the same paper technique and you just stick it in right there, and you kind of just go around the outside and watch the tabs, don't tear them, and remove it. And just, you're not really washing them, you're not really scrubbing them, you're not really sanding them. You're basically just you're just sounds weird to say it, but you're just moisturizing them. It's almost like yeah, the best example I can think of is just the way that you clean a bicycle chain. Like you clean a bicycle chain with bicycle chain grease. That's light enough that it actually lifts all the water out. It lifts all the crap out by actually penetrating. Yeah, after the rain sets in and all the soot sets into the chain, the bicycle grease then removes all the water and the soot by being heavier than the water. And that's why you don't just spray your bicycle chains. You actually use a grease, or you use a oil. And that's why you shouldn't use WD-40, because WD-40 is too light. And if it's too light, then it's going to end up becoming like, not only is it not going to last, but it's going to like very, very easily just become like water again, where it's so light, it's just going to immediately attract soot, and you're going to end up with a dirty chain all over again, but maybe even worse, because it's actually like heavier than, because WD-40 is actually heavier than water. So you're gonna end up with like this grime on your chain. So that's the only analogy I could think of for how you'd want to keep maintaining the rubber. Yeah, rubber's really weird. And if you know much about the way that you maintain your car tires, that's pretty much the same thing, right? It's like, your cars have to car tires have to be out in the sun, and it has to be protected, otherwise they're gonna crack. So it's a similar process of just kind of getting them tuned to your room's temperature fluctuations, not letting, and just pretty much not putting them in a room. Don't put them in a room where the temperature fluctuates too much, and don't allow the humidity to fluctuate too much, and it'll be perfectly fine. You shouldn't have to mess with them too much. After I pretty much clean them like once every year and year and a half, and not because of any kind of a habit, not because I have any kind of a principle or anything like that. I would only clean them if they look like they need to be cleaned. That's it. It's that simple. And it takes only about like 5 minutes, I guess, if I have the materials on hand, and that's it. And then it lasts for as long as until the next time it seems like I might need it again. And the only time it ever seems to need it again is if you happen to have extreme weather conditions, like, if it gets really hot or it gets really cold or the humidity gets really crazy, or it gets like super dry. And that's the only time. Or if you just don't use your speakers. You want to use your speakers. Like, if you just pack them away and they just sit there and they don't move, it's kind of like anything else, right? They get stiff. And if they get stiff, then they get uneven. And they can actually then become, more susceptible to cracking and stuff like that, just due to like gravity or something. It's just that these things are meant to move, and when they move, they circulate, and they end up pretty much taking care of themselves. But if you just keep them unplugged and you want to store them away, you could put them in a box and just wrap them with like some paper or something like that, and store it in some place where it's not gonna store it someplace where it's gonna have some temperature control, so it doesn't get too wet or too cold, too hot or too dry. And that's it. Same thing applies to taking care of this guy. Same thing applies to take care of anything, really. But yeah, I'm trying to think of any other warnings, because I don't want anyone to screw anything up. That's like the hardest thing. Is like, I hate giving bad advice where someone could potentially do something wrong from something I say, and I end up feeling bad. But so ask questions if you feel like I'm not being clear enough, and if there's anything else, then yeah, just leave a question if you're unsure at all. And if you need any other help, then yeah, just feel free to just respond, comment, whatever. If I don't see your comment, then you know how to otherwise find me. Okay, thanks.